The book's called Dharma Democracy in two senses. It's kind of a play on the word Dharma in two senses of the word. One is simply that Dharma means duty. And the idea that the narrative of a democracy of duties is something that plays very well in India, and I believe would play well across the developing world, as opposed to a democracy of rights, which is how we might frame democracy.
Welcome, everyone. It's Jeff from the Burning Archive here, and today I'm talking with Salvatore Babones from the University of Sydney, a political sociologist who has just published this excellent book, Dharma.
I've got a copy too.
There we go, Dharma Democracy. Double promo. How India built the third world's first democracy. Welcome, Salvatore.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Unlike probably 99% of viewers, you've actually met Narendra Modi, I believe, when he came to Sydney as well, and you've been doing this research project on India and democracy over the last 5 years or so, which is the focus of your book. And we'll get to that in a second, but I just was keen maybe just to get a quick comment from you, because we're speaking in the midst of some, not insignificant tension between the US and India over trade talks and remarks about dead economies and that sort of thing. What do you think this current spat, if you like, between India and US is telling us, not so much about the United States as whether India is a little bit more capable than maybe people tend to think it is?
Really what it tells us is that both Donald Trump and Narendra Modi play to domestic audiences. Both are politicians first and national leaders second. They are playing to their to their own countries. Neither cares much about how his statements appear in the other country. Very little of economic importance, I think, is going to come of any of this. And I don't think it's a real diplomatic spat. That is to say, I don't think there's any ill will that will result from this. But Narendra Modi wants to appear strong and in command within India, and Donald Trump, of course, loves trolling world leaders everywhere, and so we have this clash of words that I really don't think has any practical implications as far as economic relations or broader diplomatic relations go.
Yeah, that's interesting. A bit of maybe a storm in a teacup.
I'm confident it is a storm in a teacup.
I mean, I have seen a few commentators, ex-ambassadors and things comment that, the mood on the street in India is very different to the sort of mood in the government, I guess, or the diplomats, etc. And the diplomats and governments just need to proceed calmly, whatever the sort of mood on the street might be, which kind of reinforces your comment in India about domestic. Yeah,
the mood in India will change 10 times by Friday, and Donald Trump will also. So it really doesn't matter. I'm sorry. I tend to be very unconcerned about these sort of things, because I promise you, 1 year from now, no one will even remember this happened. Yeah. And that's often the case with things that we get caught up with in headlines. But this spat most of all. I mean, India-U.S. trade is very thin. There's really very little involved in India-U.S. trade. The differences in wages between India and the U.S. are so enormous that any tariffs really wouldn't make much difference anyway. And neither economy would be impacted. I mean, neither economy would even feel the result of even a catastrophic drop in trade, which catastrophic doesn't mean to zero. 20% would be an unprecedented, enormous, Great Depression era drop in trade, and a 20% drop in trade between the U.S. and India, which will not happen, I want to be clear. Even that wouldn't be felt by either economy.
Indeed.
Tempest in a teacup, indeed.
So we'll leave that to be tomorrow's fish and chips for now, and fish and chips wrapper. One of the impetuses for your book was the sort of general climate of opinion, I guess, particularly in Western countries over the last 10 or so years, that India had had degenerated from its former status as a clear democracy under the BJP government since 2014. And in particular, some of the sort of indexes and commentary. I mean, I noticed myself some of the commentary around the 2024 election was quite dramatic. Can you tell us what your hypothesis is about why there is this attitude towards Indian democracy amongst some in the West?
Bizarrely, we wouldn't know that Indian democracy had supposedly deteriorated if the European Union hadn't funded a grant proposal back in 2015. There's an organization called the Varieties of Democracy Institute. It's become very quickly the world-leading democracy rating agency. It's at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. It's only been publishing reports since 2017. Until they published their first report, the world didn't know that India had a low-quality democracy. They're the ones who pegged it at a relatively low level, and they've relentlessly brought it down since 2017 with more and more dire reports. Now, before that, all the major democracy indices we had were rating India very high, some as high as Western European countries, others on a par with Eastern European members of the European Union. So, clear democracies, but maybe not as well institutionalized as, France or England. We only know, quote unquote, that India has declined as a democracy because of this new index. And where does the new index get its data? Well, completely differently from all of the other major indices, it gets its data from the country being studied. That is to say, it surveys Indian political scientists on a whole series of questions. They don't simply ask, is India a democracy? They ask a whole series of questions that then get amalgamated into an index. Now, the other indices were outsiders looking in, and those evaluations were very high. But what we're getting from India now are insiders, for lack of a better word, complaining about their country, with the result that we take on board their complaints. But because the complaints ultimately are filtered through a Western institution, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, they have that imprimatur of, well, the Swedes, the Europeans, say that India has failed as a democracy. I don't think that's the case. I think when we look at things objectively, we can show that for every index that we can verify objectively, the index is wrong. But the simple fact is, as I wrote in the title of a newsletter last week, India's political scientists don't like Narendra Modi. And as a result, they have claimed that under Narendra Modi, Indian democracy has failed. Now, it's the same phenomenon as if you were to ask, there were two famous Yale professors famously left America for Toronto because of the election of Donald Trump. And they claim that the United States is no longer a democracy. Well, if you polled these American democracy experts about American democracy, they would say, no, America is now a fascist dictatorship. Would we believe that? Probably not. It would just be their venue for complaining about the United States. Well, that's what we have with India, is a venue for complaining about India. But the magic of numbers, once you put a number on something, a ranking on something, it becomes real in people's minds.
Yeah, indeed. And it's, I've on my channel been following Dr. S. Jaishankar in particular, focusing on Indian foreign policy and that sort of thing over the last couple of years. And he's made quite a reputation for himself for pushing back against, Western journalists. I think famously, he was in Sydney for the Raisina Dialogue. Raisina Dialogue a year or two ago. Just prior to the election, and made some comments about George Soros and that sort of thing. So there's a whole gallery now of his witty pushbacks against the sort of Western commentary on India as a democracy. And it seems to reflect a more confident, assertive mood, amongst leaders in India and associated with the BJP, etc. And this funny term that people use about Hindu nationalism. Do you see the same thing? And what really is the BJP and this idea of Hindu nationalism? Does it even exist?
Look, Dr. Jaishankar, Subramanian Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister of
Mm,
India, is an interesting character. If you carefully listen to what he says, he rarely, if ever, I don't think I've ever heard him actually defend Indian democracy. Instead, he asserts that you have no right to judge our country. And while that may be true, that's hardly a robust defense. He never gets into the details. He never tries to present an alternative case. And personally, I think that's a major failure for an external affairs minister who should be involved in public diplomacy, which is to say, he shouldn't just be defending India for a domestic audience. So the message for a domestic audience is, how dare you criticize India?
mm,
That plays very well in India. Instead, he should be going through the statistics and going through the numbers on India for a Western audience, which he doesn't do. And as a result, he doesn't make any friends in the Western media. There aren't sympathetic profiles or sympathetic reports of his rebuttals of criticisms because he doesn't rebut the criticisms. He just says they're wrong and that you have no right to criticize. Now, I've told Indians before, I've even told members of the Indian government, that's the sort of thing that Russia or China does. Says, well, you Westerners have no right to judge us. Well, maybe that's true, but the fact is, unlike Russia or China, India has the same kinds of liberal democratic institutions that we do, and those institutions operate very well in India. There are real checks on executive authority. There are real checks on what the government can do. There's real accountability in India. There's a very vibrant press in India. Every single thing gets reported and endlessly dissected, pro-government or anti-government. There's nothing like a Russia, and certainly not like a Chinese press in
mm.
India. And yet, on freedom of the press rankings, on democracy rankings, India is now being grouped with Russia and China, which is just crazy.
Yes,
And
it's quite
part of the
bizarre.
reason for that defensiveness is this rise of, what is unfortunately called Hindu nationalism. I mean, the word travels. I avoided it for years until I just accepted that there's no better term for it. And the reason I resisted it is there's nothing Hindu about Hindu nationalism. It's nationalism among people of Hindu faith, but it's not particularly Hindu in any religious orientation. It's not the same as if we say Islamism, where people are doing things in the name of their religion. Hindu nationalists are not doing things in the name of Lord Ram or in the name of Shiva. It's simply that Hindus in India have become, probably always were, very nationalistic, but it's become very public now and very
Mm,
aggressive. Unless we associate that only with the BJP, the same is true of pretty much every political party in India. You won't find any political party in India that has qualms about nationalism.
mm,
In fact, the Indian National Congress, the leading opposition party and the official opposition party, routinely criticizes the BJP for not being nationalist enough, which is
mm,
kind of crazy to Western ears. But that's the narrative in India.
mm,
So this muscular defensiveness on the part of India doesn't just come from the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Indian People's Party, the governing party of Narendra Modi. It comes from all sides in India. That said, the INC leader Rahul Gandhi has been active in criticizing Indian democracy, and he's actually saying at time of recording that he has a nuclear bomb that he's going to explode of documentation of vote fraud. But he's been saying that for a week, and we haven't
mm,
seen it yet. So he's
mm.
very critical of Indian democracy, but he's certainly not critical of India.
Yeah,
He's critical of the government for not being Indian enough.
yeah. I think in your book you describe the BJP as essentially like a modernising party, and I guess
Very much so.
its role partly in Indian history is, I mean, it's been the first government for quite a long time that's had a pretty strong sort of majority,
Yeah.
consolidated executive, so to speak, which is pretty standard practice in Western democracies. Um, uh, um, you know, um, did you want to just say a bit about that, about the idea of the BJP as a modernising party, so people get a more
Sure.
realistic sense of what it's about?
Look, I use modernizing in its technical social science sense. That is, the BJP is not an old style party based on family loyalties. It's not a party based on caste divisions and caste identity. It's not a party based on linguistic nationalism. All of those kinds of parties exist in India. The BJP is a modern, bureaucratic political party that operates much like the U.S. Democrats or Republicans or the Australian Liberals or Labor, which is to say, it's yes, if you're a child of a parliamentarian, you may have a little leg up, but the party's not run by any particular family. It's not going to get you elected. It's not going to get you a position if you're not going to win the votes. I mean, it's ruthlessly committed to winning votes on a bureaucratic organization buttressed by a famously efficient IT cell. That is, their information arm is extremely professional, using census data and social media data to target not just particular districts, particular voting booths, with getting the right message specifically to that voting booth. They'll have customized vote sheets or position sheets for every particular voting booth around India. It's not just a single placard for the country. It's highly differentiated micro targeting. In that sense, it's adopted all the modern tools of the marketing world in the internet age to the pursuit of politics. That's very different from other political parties. So the main opposition party, the Indian National Congress, is a family-run party. It's the descendants of Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren who run the party. It is, on the other hand, there are
It's basically
caste-based.
a family dynasty, isn't it?
It's a family dynasty, much like you would find in Bangladesh or Pakistan. There are caste-based parties that are simply members of a particular caste who all vote for a particular party leader. There are linguistic nationalist parties that are, especially in South India, that are organized on the basis of, if you speak Tamil or if you speak Telugu, you should vote for this party. Those are traditional forms of organization that we would expect in a poor developing country. And I think the reason that one of the main reasons India has survived as a democracy is that it has navigated this transition to modern unifying politics in a way that, and when I call BJP unifying, a lot of people think, no, it's divisive. Well, yes, its language is divisive. It's particularly divisive towards Muslim Indians. That's a fact. But it unifies across all of these major divisions in society. And it unifies mainly Hindu voters. It does some Muslim outreach, particularly with Sufi Muslims and other Muslim minority groups. But among the majority Sunni Muslim community in India, it does relatively little outreach, makes very little effort to appeal to them. But outside of that one minority, in the BJP unifies people across caste divisions, across language divisions, across sectarian divisions within the Hindu faith. And in that sense, it's creating an India-wide network that is something that other political parties in India have to start to emulate if they're ever going to compete with it.
Interesting. The comparison that's going in my mind, it may be a bit of an unfair comparison, but it's with, Blair's New Labour modernising Britain in whenever it was, 70s, 80s, or
structurally,
90s,
structurally, absolutely, yes.
New
political
techniques,
message,
different political message, but the kind of structural role replacing a sort of somewhat moribund, party traditions or that kind of thing. So you call India Dharma democracy.
Title of the book.
Yeah, title of the book. Do you just want to explain what you mean by that term and what you see as some of the strengths of, because you really present India as a success story of democracy.
Absolutely.
What are some of the strengths of India's democracy?
The book's called Dharma Democracy in two senses. It's kind of a play on the word Dharma in two senses of the word. One is simply that Dharma means duty. And the idea that the narrative of a democracy of duties is something that plays very well in India, and I believe would play well across the developing world, as opposed to a democracy of rights, which is how we might frame democracy. Now, India has human rights, civil rights. This is not an issue. A lot of people think Muslims are repressed in India. There's a lot of Muslim segregation and Muslim discrimination, but Muslims have always had full civil rights, full voting rights, full legal rights. I mean, that's not an issue in India. India has civil rights, but the narrative around democracy is not one of you're Indian and therefore you have these inalienable rights, as an American might think of it. It's instead, you're Indian and so you have these duties to your country. And that's especially important in a developing country scenario where there are multiple internal insurgencies, there are multiple language communities, people are divided on caste. So emphasizing to everybody that they have a duty to their country, not just rights from their country, I think is a successful formula. But of course, Dharma is also inextricably tied up with Hindu faith, and more broadly with Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh faith, but especially Hindu faith. And I call the book Dharma Democracy because India has succeeded in creating a Hindu civil society that permeates all of India across the entire continental-sized country. And that Hindu civil society is what has supported democracy through its most difficult trials. That is, most countries, virtually all countries, start out as democracies. I mean, all of the post-colonial countries of the developing world have democratic constitutions. The problem isn't that their constitutions are undemocratic. Nobody says, I'm founding this country to be a dictatorship. The country's always founded to be a democracy. It's just that the democracy always fails very quickly. In India, there was a strong enough civil society that when democracy did fail, when its founding leader, and I borderline call him a dictator, Jawaharlal Nehru, when he died, Indian democracy survived. When his daughter, Indira Gandhi, imposed emergency rule and attempted to literally rule as a dictator, Indian democracy survived. And it survived because its civil society was strong enough to hold it together. Now, that said, we have to immediately recognize that Hindu society and civil society in India excluded and still excludes Muslim Indians, with the result that India is a strong democracy with a problem of social exclusion. The same way, if we look at the United States in the 1950s, clearly it was a democracy in the 1950s. It was, the great era of American democracy in many ways, but it had Jim Crow. It had severe exclusion of African Americans. It even had denial of civil rights to African Americans and voting rights. Yet it was still a democracy with a race problem. India is a democracy with a religious problem.
One could almost say the same about, some Europe, like France, perhaps today,
A democracy with a
exactly.
religion problem. And look, some would say Australia is a democracy with an indigenous problem, that, rural and remote indigenous people are largely excluded from the mainstream of Australian society. Is that a failing? Of course it is. Does that prevent Australia being a democracy? Of course it doesn't.
Indeed. So we talked there about, I guess, the discrimination against Muslims, and in a way that's inseparable from the history of the formation of India and partition in 1947. And you talk about how India is dealing with the challenge of both the legacy of partition, very complex event, and the sort of religious tolerance, I guess, or religious acceptance within Indian society. How is India dealing with those two big challenges?
There are low levels of Muslim participation in peak institutions in India, whether that's parliament, the Lok Sabha, where we can see the extremely low. Muslims make up a little over 14% of the population, less than 5% of the parliament. But more broadly, we can see it in media. We can see it in civil society organizations, in leadership positions, in places like hospitals and schools. The only place we don't see it is Bollywood. There's a strong Muslim presence in Bollywood, much like there's a strong African American presence in Hollywood. So being a minority group does not mean you can't succeed in entertainment. But in every other sphere of Indian life, there's a deficit of Muslim Indians. That said, we can look back to the partition of India in 1947, when the Muslim intellectual class from all of India, not just from the areas that became Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Muslim intellectual class largely left India to build their futures in Pakistan. And when I say largely, I mean almost entirely, whether it's the military. Again, another statistic, military officers in India, there are very few Muslim military officers. Why? Well, more than 95% of the military officer cadre opted to go to Pakistan in 1947. The civil service, again, more than 95% of Muslim civil servants opted to go to Pakistan. Even Muslim military officers and civil servants who hailed from areas that would ultimately become part of India left to go and build their careers in Pakistan. So it's a generational process of rebuilding that Muslim intelligentsia in India. The ones who were left in India were largely connected with the mosques. That is, they were directly involved in preaching to the people, with the result that Muslim civil society in India, such as it is today, is overwhelmingly dominated by ultra-religious groups. And they're ultra-religious not because there's something evil about them, but because what would you expect a bunch of imams to be? I mean, of course they're highly religious, and they're very focused on religion as the basis of their participation in society. Now, that's a challenge. It's not just a challenge for 1947, because we have lots of data to suggest that whether it's in India or in the West, who becomes professors, children of professors? Who becomes civil servants, children of civil servants? Who becomes lawyers, children of lawyers? Who becomes military officers, children of military officers? So this has rippled through India for the last several generations. It's slowly dissipating, but not quickly enough. Now, affirmative action can be a very touchy subject for people. I think it's probably, in general, it does not work as a strategy for improving the lives of ordinary people, because it generally benefits elites in any particular area. It doesn't benefit the ordinary people from the group. That said, it's probably important for India to have a higher level of representation. And thus, while I would not recommend India have a legal affirmative action program, minimum number of Muslim candidates for parliament or minimum number of Muslims sit on boards of directors, I think that would be very divisive. On the other hand, if I were running an Indian board of directors, I would look to, maybe we should have at least one Muslim on our board. If I were running an Indian civil society organization, I would ask, maybe we should have at least one Muslim on our executive staff. And these are the questions that India has not yet asked, that I really think the country needs to start asking, the Indian elite needs to start asking in the future.
And I guess to some degree, I mean, I'm not by any means a specialist on this, but I have been reading this book by Joya Chatterjee, Shadows at Noon, the South Asian 20th Century, which does explore these issues in quite a bit of depth. But I mean, the movement of the Muslim intellectuals to Pakistan was not all push factor. It should be clear. It's also partly because Pakistan was formed in part through a loose term.
It was formed entirely to be a homeland for Muslim
an
Indians.
Islamic state.
That was the rhetoric of Pakistan was to be a homeland for Muslims.
Yeah, indeed. And I guess the complex history between India and Pakistan since has no doubt shaped attitudes and issues in ways that perhaps you're saying perhaps it's maybe time to get beyond a little bit, I guess, at least within India's domestic policies, if not its foreign policies.
Well, look, for you and me, it's ancient history, but let's remember, if you go back to the history, Hindu India, to a person, I mean, I can't find a single Indian intellectual of the 1920s, 30s, or 40s who advocated a separation of Muslims and Hindus from India. The entire demand for Pakistan came from the Muslim side, in particular from Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who would become the first president of Pakistan. There was no pressure from the Hindu side to eject Muslims. There were lots of hurt feelings along the lines of, why don't you want to live with us? So that there's a lingering resentment of the departure, that Muslims left India, and now people complain that why doesn't India have Muslim leaders.
Mm,
I understand the resentment over it. That said,
mm,
it's been several generations. Um, Indians may have that historical trauma still in their families and still in their knowledge, but I routinely tell Indian audiences, Hindu Indian audiences, that
mm,
there are 200 million Muslims in India, and they're not going to go anywhere. Okay, so you hear the rhetoric sometimes. Why don't you go to Pakistan? Directed at Muslim Indians. Well, the time for that is past. I mean, you might have yelled at their great grandparents. Why don't you go to Pakistan? You insisted on it. But it's not the people living today who insisted on Pakistan. In fact, all of our statistics suggest that Muslim Indians are highly patriotic Indians. They answer 99%. They're proud to be Indian. They want to be part of the Indian mainstream. There seems to be a strong appetite among Muslim Indians to be accepted as Indians. There's no Muslim outmigration from India. I mean, there is to the United States, but that's for obvious reasons. They want to upgrade. But there's no Muslim outmigration to peer countries. So there's no Muslim outmigration to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, certainly not to Afghanistan. It simply doesn't exist. Muslim Indians want to be Indians.
mm,
It's time that Hindu Indians accepted that partitions in the past, and it's time to live for the 21st century.
mm. It also relates to this kind of complex issue of, I guess, what kind of state India and Pakistan are. Is it a religious, Islamic state,
Yeah.
as Pakistan was conceived initially? Is it a nation state? If it's a nation state, what is its language? What is its sense of citizenship, all that sort of thing? And there's this new term, or not so new, but fashionable, let's say, term at the moment of civilization state that is being used, and which I've promised my Substack readers I'll write an article on one day. Um, and particularly, it's in the context of this book, which became very popular in India. There we go, India.
Yeah. Oh, you got it.
That is Bharat. Yep, yep. I bought it a little while ago, and
You'll be
had a
very disappointed in the
quick.
sequel.
Oh well, apparently the second volume is apparently out, but
Yeah, the second volume is not very good. The India that it's brought is a very well written book. It's a very good book.
yeah. But I guess there's also talk amongst various people in India about this idea that India is a civilization state, China is a civilization state, that sort of thing. It's something more than just a nation state. What's your, and you comment on that in your book,
Yeah,
including on India,
I
that is
dismiss it.
Bharat. Yeah. What's
Yeah,
your
I
thinking
dismiss
there?
it. Look, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Maldives are all Muslim states. I mean, they're not just Muslim majority countries. They're to greater or lesser degrees officially Muslim states. Not so. India is not an officially Hindu state. It is a secular state that has a Hindu majority. Much in the same way, in an earlier era, Australia would have been a secular state that had a Christian majority. And in many ways, that's the best way to think of India, to think of Australia, 40 or 50 years ago, when the Christianity of Australia was not something legal. It was just something everybody knew, right? So if there was a religion class in schools 50 years ago, of course it would be a Christian religious class. Not so today, but 50 years ago, obviously, yes. Public holidays in Australia, well, Easter and Christmas are public holidays. But wait, Australia's a secular state. Why are Easter and, well, because the majority of the population, was practicing Christian at the time. Why are Sundays a day off? And why do people get double pay in the retail sector on Sundays? Well, because Sunday's the day of religious worship. Well, not for Muslims, not for Jews, not for Hindus, but for Christians. Well, in the same way, India is a Hindu state, and much less so than Australia 50 years ago would have been a Christian state. I'm sorry, India's a Hindu country, much less so than Australia 50 years ago was a Christian country, in that Hindu religious holidays are not public holidays in India. Hindu faith is not taught in the schools in India. There's a strict secularity of state institutions. That said, many Hindus are dissatisfied with that. Many Hindus want more of a recognition of the centrality of Hindu faith to the whole idea of India. And thus there's this new move to redefine India from being a secular nation state to being a Hindu civilizational state. And the problem with that is it's simply not true. There is a great Hindu civilization, to quote the title of another book by Pavan Varma, but that great Hindu civilization is centered on what's now India, but has nothing to do with the current Indian state. And I might add, the same is true of China. I mean, there's the civilizational state is a very evocative concept, but the fact is, China has been ever more forcing its population into a Han Chinese nation state where everyone in China must conform to Han Chinese standards. And China has been working very hard to suppress regional dialects and regional languages like Cantonese and Fujianese, and instead substitute Mandarin to create a unified, single language, single ethnicity nation state out of the country. It's largely succeeded in the Northeast. I hear fantasies about a future independent Manchuria. It's never going to happen. What was once called Manchuria is now simply Chinese. There's no, and that's happening now in South China as well. The idea that there would be an independent Cantonese state sometime in the future is, again, a fantasy of international relations scholars and political scientists. It's never going to happen. India is similarly a nation state. Now, its nation has been created purely on a civic national identity, bizarrely, I mean, almost uniquely, without any reference to language. I mean, the only real parallel is maybe Switzerland has succeeded in creating a Swiss identity that is not just German. I mean, we all think German when we think Swiss. Yeah, but we all know there's Geneva and Neuchâtel. We all know there's a small Italian part of Switzerland. And, in the same way, India is 40% Hindi speaking. It's 60 or 70% Hindi understanding, or speaking Hindi as a second language, being able to work in Hindi. And so it's a Hindi nation that's been developed. But the state is still a secular state that recognizes regional languages, that has no official language. I mean, that has 20 official languages. But, so the practice in parliament, for example, is to speak Hindi. The practice in courts is that the laws have been in English. But that English and Hindi dominance is a matter of practice, not a matter of identity. So India has successfully built a nation, and it's built that nation upon its unified Hindu civil society. But the state is, not, the state has created its own identity as the Indian state, and everybody accepts that compromise to a greater or lesser degree.
It's interesting. I mean, I think in a way Samuel Huntington did everyone a terrible disfavor by effectively defining civilizations by religious affiliation.
I'm not a Huntington fan.
No, nor am I. But in the talk about civilization state, I hear something like, there's an aspiration to, I guess, get beyond, the colonial experience of Western defined political traditions, and also a sense of, I guess, like, India is clearly something more, say, than a nation state like Australia. Okay, so
look, can I cut to the chase?
So,
they're jealous of China, right?
Yeah.
Sorry to say it, but if China gets to be a civilizational state, then we get to be a civilizational state. Is really what's driving the narrative. And the fact is, China's not a civilizational state. The fact that Martin Jacques picked up, ironically, an Indian term, the term civilizational state, was originally developed with reference to India. And it was originally developed, ironically, to characterize India as a syncretic civilization that included strands from the Hindu strand, but also a major Muslim strand and a British strand, and that all these mixed in a civilization in India, not a nation, but a unified civilization. So ironically, the very word civilizational state came from India, but look, Indian nationalists are jealous that China gets to call the civilizational state, and India is as good as or better than China and everything, so India gets to be a civilizational state. I don't think there's any analytical rigor behind it. When they add the word state to it, it implies that the literal Indian state institutions are somehow civilizational when they're not. India may have a civilization. There's a great civilization that's centered on India, but it's not connected to India's state institutions in any way. And people who want to make it out to be a Hindu civilization in India, and that's the civilizational state of India, I always point out, well, what about the northeast of India, which is not majority Hindu? Are they part of the Indian civilizational state? They say, oh, of course, we welcome it. Well, what about Nepal? That's a Hindu majority country. Why isn't that part? Oh, no, Nepal's an independent. It's not part of it. There's this very selective application of the idea of a civilizational state. Look, it just doesn't hold empirical water. It's very evocative. People love the term. Let them enjoy it, but it doesn't mean anything.
Indeed. I guess my perspective is I tend to agree with you about the concept, but it's sort of like, well, what's the there's something people are reaching for there, and I guess that's what I'm sort of curious about. And maybe that brings us to the next question I had, which was about a remark from Gautam Desiraju that I saw on your X account, which everyone should check out, that he said, by 2035, I foresee a world that will become the playground of four empires, America, China, India, and Russia, rather than a patchwork of nation states, organic or artificial. And of course, the empire concept of empire is as complex as the concept of civilization. What did you find interesting about that remark?
So first, Gautam Desiraju is an extremely eminent structural chemist, one of the most highly cited chemists in the world. He's either recently retired or he's in the process of retiring from the Indian Institute of Science, where he heads a major lab. And his retirement project is political science, is to get involved. So he's written 2 books now on Indian government reform, and this seems to be the direction he's going with his retirement career. I mainly cited the piece because we've become friends in the writing of my book. I reached out to him, as I did all the authors I read. Not all, many of the authors I read in writing my book. And his ideas on government reform are really very interesting for India. He would like to see India divided into some 75 states instead of the present 30-something, to foster greater administrative efficiency is really his goal. So I am aware of his work, and I read his work because I already know him. That said, his comments on the future 4 empires, I disagree with, and I question them in my tweet on it. There's a lot of appetite in the world for the end of American hegemony or the end of American empire. And I've been writing for the last 30 years that it's not going to happen. And I've heard throughout my career that Japan was going to displace America, the Soviet Union was going to displace America, the European Union was going to displace America, now China is going to displace America, then it's the BRICS are going to displace America, and it's just not going to happen. The centrality of the United States in global economic networks is so deeply entrenched, and the lead that the United States has over the other major areas of the world is just so enormous that the pull of the United States will persist at least the rest of this century, and I think probably for many centuries thereafter. I actually wrote a book on this called American Tiansha. Tiansha is the Chinese word for all under heaven. Broadly can be translated as the Chinese world. I use the word Tiansha instead of empire because the United States is not an empire over the rest of the world. It's a strange empire where other countries are begging to have U.S. troops and protest when an American president threatens to withdraw his troops from the imperial possession. So it's not an empire in any conventional sense. That said, it is the global leader of a global world, and China has reached its high point and is now receding as a global influence. Its military may be still growing, but Chinese influence, anyone who's been watching Chinese influence for the last 20 years will have seen a peak around 2020, and it's certainly not what it used to be. Indian influence is rising, but India is still far poorer than China. It's about one quarter the GDP and GDP per capita. Russia is a regional bully with a lot of nuclear weapons, but I think if you were to assess, for example, the Polish versus Russian militaries in a straight-up fight, Poland probably beats Russia. Right? Russia's no longer the global power it used to be. So although that rhetoric reflects an appetite among many Indians that we should live in a multipolar world, and I understand the desire that many people have to live in a multipolar world, we don't live in a multipolar world. We still live in a unipolar world, and that one pole is the United States.
Is there any aspiration among Indian elites to, I guess, redraw the boundaries of India? Like, I mean, there's, the Balochistan issue, there's Kashmir issue, all this kind of stuff.
Redraw is an interesting word because on Indian maps, all of Kashmir, right up to the Afghan border, is part of India. So it's a faux pas in India not to say that Afghanistan shares a border with India, and that's happened in Parliament where somebody excluded Afghanistan from India's neighbors, and they got a grilling because
but
India and Afghanistan are neighbors.
Clearly there's a Balochistan Liberation Army.
Balochistan is part of that's in Pakistan. Yep. So if Balochistan were to become independent, it would be carved out of Western Pakistan. It wouldn't border India. No, there's very little evidence. So there's a little bit of talk in India about that India needs. This is very ironic in the era of Donald Trump, that India needs a deep state. America has a deep state, and so India should have one too, and that India should become more imperialistic and become more like China in pushing its agenda in developing countries. There's very little appetite though in India. India has always been a status quo country. Of all the many wars it's fought, India has always been invaded. India has never initiated a war, and there's very little evidence of Indian appetite for overseas adventurism. That seems to have died with Rajiv Gandhi, the father of the current opposition leader, Rahul Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister during the worst days of the Sri Lankan civil war and sent Indian peacekeeping troops to Sri Lanka, who quickly became embroiled in the conflict, and ultimately he was assassinated by Tamil assassins they were Indian but connected with the Sri Lankan liberation tigers. So that very bloody episode in Indian history, seems to have ended any idea that India would intervene, even as far afield as Sri Lanka, never mind trying to influence affairs in Africa or Southeast Asia. So the idea that India would ever become an empire, I mean, never say never, maybe in the 22nd century, but not during the lifetimes of people who are currently thinking about anything in India.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because occasionally there's these references to some Hindu nationalist thinkers who talk about a greater Bharata. I can't remember the exact term, but your sense is that's a very marginal.
There's the idea, but it's fantastical. It's the idea that, for example, one of the great centers of learning and commerce and ideas of ancient India is now in Afghanistan. And, would that ancient city be resurrected as a new Hindu empire in Afghanistan? Clearly not. I mean, this is never going to happen. Even revanchism regarding Pakistan, there's a lot of nostalgic sort of thinking around, India deserves Pakistan back. But then when you press these, opinion makers, well, what about the whatever 80
Do you
million
really want to
Muslims,
do that?
200 million. Oh no, they don't want the Muslims. It's like, well, if you get Lahore, you get its residents. You don't
Mm,
just get the
mm.
city somehow
Yeah, yeah.
denuded of all Muslim residents. And there's no appetite in India, certainly among Hindu Indians. There's no appetite for reunification
Yeah.
of India, unless everyone in Pakistan and Bangladesh were to convert to Hindu faith, which is not going to happen. So yeah, these are very marginal, poorly thought through
Mm.
um, intellectual exercises. Yes, the rhetoric is there, but the rhetoric it's incendiary rhetoric that has no practical or popular appeal.
Yeah. And I guess one of the reasons I raise it is partly it gets, becomes a bit of a slur, I guess, with the whole. It's a bit like your democracy index. These sort of things, get a life of their own in the non-Indian media, and then sort of become representative of something that isn't really
And look,
there.
these ideas do exist, but
Yeah.
they're marginal, borderline crazy ideas. And when I say that, uh, try to find, instead of finding the slogan, try to find a book that actually presents the case. There is no book that presents the case, because it's a fantastical idea that doesn't have any reality behind it. So you can't even find a firebrand writer who presents this as a thesis in a book. All you find is a quote in a speech, right? Rhetoric on Twitter. It exists. It's certainly there, but it's of no practical importance.
Yep. So my final question is about, I guess, lessons for or issues, let's say, rather than lessons for Australia in its relationship with India. On my Substack on the weekend, I was writing about the issue of migration within and from India. And just check the Australian Bureau of Statistics overseas migration numbers, and there's Indian is now the second largest overseas born group, and will probably overtake Britain in the next year, I would
I don't
say.
think there's a probably about it. I think there's a certainly overtake.
I
Britain.
guess
If
one
not this
never
year,
knows
next
about
year.
the future. I always qualify, but yeah, almost certainly the case, and that the history of migration between India and Australia is actually quite long. And are you still chair of the Australia-India Roundtable?
No. The Indian Century Roundtable, and
Indian
I'm
Century
the
Roundtable.
director, but not the chair. Mr. Maurice
Director.
Newman is chair of the organization.
Yeah. So what do you see as, maybe some of the issues for Australia in its relationship with India?
The biggest issue right now is recognition of professional qualifications. There's a lot of pressure on the Indian side for that. You'll notice when we had the economic framework, trade framework agreement, the ECTA agreement, on the Australian side, what Australia wanted was reduced tariffs from India. On the Indian side, what it wanted was visas and recognition of professional qualifications. And that's driven by popular demand. Of course, it doesn't really benefit India that its professional qualifications are recognized in Australia. It benefits Indians who then leave the country. But nonetheless, there's political pressure in India to get that recognition. Beyond that, there is a growing and unrecognized problem that Australia's immigration from India increasingly consists of low-skill temporary visa holders instead of high-skill permanent visa holders. And that transition is very visible anytime you order an Uber Eats. It's also very visible in the university sector. And that will change the quality of the immigration pool coming from India. I don't mean necessarily the quality. Well, it will change the quality in terms of high or low quality of skills, but it also changes the quality in terms of how that community behaves. So right now, for example, the Indian immigrant community in Australia is a very, very peaceful group of relatively high-income professionals. If you add in a large number of low-skilled young people working in dead-end occupations, has the potential in the future to change the character of the community in a less salubrious direction. It hasn't happened yet, but the numbers being admitted on short-term work visas, in which I include student visas, because a student visa in Australia is a work visa. The numbers are truly enormous, and what that will mean for the future of the Australian Indian community is very hard to say, because we have very little good data about this.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Salvatore. Do you want to just maybe mention where people can check out your writing and your you comment quite a bit in the Indian media too, and also, of course, give a plug for your book.
Yeah, well, of course, the book I'm promoting right now is Dharma Democracy, How India Built the Third World's First Democracy. A lot of Indians get upset at that subtitle, Third World, and I tell them that first, there's nothing to be ashamed about the third world. It just means the non-aligned world, not part of the US or the Soviet world. But also, if you are ashamed of it, fix it and become a richer country. It's not my fault that India is a very poor country, on a par with the GDP per capita of the African continent. So it is the third world's first democracy, both in terms of quality and in terms of when it was founded. Of course, you can get the book all the usual places, Amazon, Booktopia, et cetera. Online, you can go direct to the publisher, Connor Court. I think they offer some kind of discount on their website. That's also possible for an Australian audience. My previous book, American Tien Sha, might be of interest to people who have a particular interest in China and China's future and the future of relations between China and the West. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter has, in effect, become an Indian Twitter handle because I have 5,000 Western followers and 120,000 Indian followers, and so I mainly tweet on Indian issues. But you can find me there. I'm very easy to look up and to connect with. And I really love to hear from people. So if anyone wants to reach out directly, just email me. You'll always get an answer.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining me, Salvatore.
Great to talk to you.